it's impossible to present information in a neutral way. With people with narcissistic personality disorder, any information whatsoever that they consume, they don't analyze it from the point of view of like, hey, is this true? It is like, how does it affect my sense of self first and foremost? They dangle the possibility that like, okay, maybe we will find a common ground or understanding. They're rather like very skilled at introducing a pre-existing kind of like biased frame where the game is rigged.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Andrés Gómez-Emilsson, Director of Research at Qualia Research Institute, and an expert on consciousness, suffering, and happiness, with a unique perspective on interpersonal manipulation. Andrés Gómez-Emilsson, what are some practical applications for a theory of consciousness?
We at QRI are very much of the mindset that better philosophy, especially better philosophy of consciousness, philosophy of mind, should cash out into better neuroscience, better ways of actually like studying the nervous system, studying the body, understanding the mind-body connection. And better neuroscience should cash out into better neurotechnology, like better techniques, better approaches to like modifying ourselves in wholesome ways, ideally in a way that doesn't change us radically, but in a sense, like amplifies the good parts of ourselves. You can look at some of the key theories at Qualia Research Institute. I would name a few. One of them is neural annealing. Is this idea that actually like one of the main mechanisms of action of something like psychedelics and meditation involve raising what we call the energy parameter in the body and in the mind, which can kind of like dislodge and melt pre-existing patterns and pre-existing priors, as you might call them, and allow you to essentially enter into a much more like harmonious state, kind of like a more solid attractor of your whole like nervous system, from which you can then build up more healthy patterns and more healthy homeostasis. If this is true, right, like it very much lends itself to optimizing it. It very much lends itself to like figuring out like, hey, in what way a particular meditation technique, not only, what is the mechanism of action, but like also to debug it. It's like, okay, what is the problem? Why is this not working for you? And, likewise, understanding the, let's say, like the long-term consequences of different like psychopharmacological interventions or different types of therapies. I think like the lens of something like neural annealing, which, ultimately comes from philosophy of mind and theories of consciousness, has a lot of kind of what we might, describe as a debugging power. It has the capacity to identify like what's wrong or like why the process is not working the way it's supposed to. I mean, I might give you like a very concrete example, which is if, like meditation very much requires kind of like an increase in the energy parameter in one way or another. And, by the energy parameter, I very much mean the sense of like aliveness, intensity, strength, the heat in the body, in the mind, the amount of activity. If you're having like long meditation sessions and at no point you're experiencing any kind of like increase in this energy parameter, chances are you're not going to benefit from the long-term transformation that these practices usually entail. So you may like kind of like think about like how you might like debug this practice and figure out ways to like inject energy into the system in one way or another that is maybe harmonious with your personality or like with your particular likes and values. Just to give a particular example is, I know a lot of people who have done a lot of meditation, and it wasn't until they figured out they could introduce, for example, like breathwork at the beginning of a session to like really activate the body and kind of like enter into this like more energized state, that they actually were able to, achieve some of these more rarefied and healing aspects of these therapies. So, that's just one of many examples. But of course, I'm curious exactly where you want to take this.
Well, we have a lot of different ways we can go now. I will come back to what you said right away, which was philosophy to neuroscience to neurotechnology. That seems really important to this practical question. But you mentioned changing patterns and things. I'm curious about habits and consciousness. When we get into a habitual state, are we less conscious? Is consciousness something that you see as being on a spectrum where we're more or less conscious?
Yes, this is a good question. A little bit complicated. I just came back from a computational neurophenomenology workshop in Austria where people had like all kinds of perspectives on this question. So it's not like there's like settled science on how to answer these. There's definitely a lot of people who say that, fully automatized, tasks are actually like completely unconscious, right? Like, in fact, like some people who describe themselves as eliminativists about consciousness or illusionists about consciousness, they might actually say that, yeah, okay, if you're driving a car and you've done this route like 100 times or 1,000 times and you know it by heart, that you were actually just not conscious all the way through. That if you think you're conscious is some kind of like retroactive, like memory consolidation effect or something of that sort. I am definitely not going to go like that far. I actually think that, yeah, we're actually conscious of a lot more things than we realize, precisely because there's a problem of encoding and of memory of what you were conscious of. In the QRI world, and this is shared across a wide range of cognitive science literature, we tend to divide an experience into attention and awareness. So attention, awareness comes up like automatically. Like if you open your eyes, you have kind of this like field of awareness. It's involuntary, spontaneous, very, very fast, less than 200 milliseconds. Whereas attention is effortful and it requires kind of like binding together different features of a scene. So like you open your eyes, you see this field of textures, and then afterwards with attention, you start consolidating the textures into actual patterns. I had a neuroscience professor who actually liked to describe this as the difference between stuff and things. That like awareness is kind of you experience stuff is like textures, but with attention you transform the textures into things. So I would actually say that like the content of awareness is part of your experience. It's definitely conscious. It's just that you're not attending to it, and so therefore you're not going to remember it. You're not going to necessarily be able to like name it or describe it afterwards. So there's a little bit of an epistemological problem here in that you may be actually aware of a wide range of things that then you might never be able to like recall, or describe to others. Now, when it comes to very kind of like automatized like patterns, I would say that, yeah, for the most part, it's not that you're becoming unconscious, or it's not that you're not conscious of them. It's just that they get processed in the field of awareness and you just don't need to pay attention to them anymore, which it does mean in a sense like they are less conscious because they occupy less of the screen of experience, but they're still made of qualia. They're still made of like raw sensations. So in that sense, I don't think ever like really you become completely, just unconscious of them. With a couple caveats, this is a whole rabbit hole, but in the predictive processing paradigm, they also call it predictive coding or the free energy principle, depending on who you talk to. The only things you really kind of like ever become aware of are the things that your body and your senses are unable to predict and anticipate, right? Like if you're seeing a very repetitive scene again and again and again, the repetition is going to be kind of like filtered out from your field of experience, and it's not gonna catch your attention. It's not gonna be memorable. It's only the things that you're just not able to anticipate and predict that actually kind of like bubble up all the way to experience. But here I would say this is very much a gradient based on a number of like arguments and psychophysics experiments. I would actually say that, even the things that your body are completely able to predict and anticipate, they still become part of your field of awareness. The thing is that they're just very far from like being attended to. They're just like not salient. So you just don't remember having experienced them, even though at some point they were part of your experience, which is something you can verify in other ways with clever experiments. But that's a deep rabbit hole.
So it's on a spectrum, but we wouldn't say that it goes to zero. Then you use the phrase gradient, which to me kind of suggests that it's still always there.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there are extreme examples where it probably does go to zero. but they're like very esoteric, and you need quite a bit of specialized conditions. I mean, like the only time, as far as I'm aware of, where like sensory stimuli is actually completely devoid of any rendering in consciousness is in the case of a meditative cessation, where you're so concentrated and so unified that there is, in fact, like some kind of like blocking of the sensory streams. And for a split second, or in the case of very advanced practitioner, it could be for longer, but usually for a split second, you just completely disappear. And it's not like you just experienced, like blackness or, a field of space or something like that. Like that actually comes like earlier. Like those are like less advanced stages. But there's like, critical moment where like, actually there's just absolutely nothing to report. In fact, I have a friend who reports like listening to music while in deep meditation. And he reports that like the moments he was experiencing cessations is not like that he experienced like, oh, now it's blanking out and then I come back to the music. It's more actually like the music skipped. Is like, okay, like I'm hearing this part of the track and then, this other part of the track all of a sudden. You just kind of like time jump, as it were. And, there's a way of making sense of a cessation in terms of like, you're making a perfect prediction of your sensory input or at least a perfect prediction of your interoceptive awareness, like your own internal signals. And therefore, completely kind of like masking them out, because there's just no need to surface them all the way to awareness. There's other interpretations for like why this is unconscious ultimately. But yeah, I mean, I would say like that's the only case. In every other case, I would argue that, there's a, in the very, very back of your awareness, field of awareness, there's a tiny, tiny, tiny faint impression of it.
Okay. So those were the edge cases. What about everyday things like sleep or anesthesia?
Sleep and anesthesia, they seem to be qualitatively different in that, if you talk to advanced practitioners, they will say that like even, like deep sleep has like a very faint kind of like sense of presence, very rarefied, very ethereal. But there is something that it is like to be in deep sleep, which is not the case with various kinds of anesthetics, which are like much more of the kind of like cessation type of phenomenology, which is like skipping time, right? Like you can see a lot of like kind of like funny, endearing, maybe a little bit upsetting like videos on YouTube of like people waking up from anesthesia, right? Like saying like, hey, when are you going to start the procedure, right?
Yeah.
Like just being very confused, like, no, it's actually been 12 hours and they have no idea that happened, right? So clearly there's examples like that. That said, like what is actually happening, like under the hood, we have reasons to suspect, at least within the QRI paradigm, the Qualia Research Institute where I work, that these are actually very different phenomena. In both cases, there is kind of an integrated experience with internal differences that you can report, but they're very, very different. So in a cessation, it's more like you become so coherent, so symmetrical, but you're still kind of like a unified being, as it were, like a unified part of reality. There's just no content. There's just like no differentiation. I mean, imagine kind of like being a perfect sphere, right? It's like a perfect sphere wouldn't be able to report anything about itself, right? Like, because it looks the same from every possible angle.
Okay.
Whereas on the case of like anesthesia, amnesic anesthesia in particular, we tend to think of it more as a kind of like mind dust. It's like you're becoming completely fragmented. You're kind of like becoming like a powder of activity, as it were, which is a very different direction. But, both would be like the sort of states that they're impossible to report on, because from both perspectives, there's just like you don't have the conditions of being an integrated object with internal differences to be able to report on.
Okay. And then you had mentioned breathwork as another one of these states. How does that fit into our gradient?
Well, breathwork, I mean, there's many, many varieties. The context within which I brought it was as an energizer. That like, if you start out, for example, like a 1 hour meditation session with 10 minutes of like pretty intense breathwork, that can actually be like really good because it activates your nervous system and your body, and then like during the other 50 minutes, maybe you're kind of like cooling down, right? And
Okay.
in our framework, the cooling down process is actually where a lot of like the work is happening, right? It's where you can harmonize the system. You can slowly get the different frequencies and vibrations in your body to sync up together. But you need kind of like that first kick to really get them to kind of like become dislodged from each other first before you can kind of like harmonize them. However, breath work in other modalities can actually be like really, really calming. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but there's a difference, for example, if you emphasize attention in the in-breath during breath work as opposed to in the out-breath. And generally speaking, if you emphasize the in-breath, the breath work will actually be like energizing. If you emphasize the out-breath, breath work in general will be like calming. And so you can play with those modalities to kind of like control your level of arousal or the energy parameter. In very advanced concentration states where you focus entirely on the breath work, that actually can be a way to cessation. Like if you can completely focus on, let's say, just like the feeling of the breath at the tip of your nose, and that becomes like the one percept that you're attending to, at the limit, you can actually converge on that and experience one of these like moments of disappearing. But I would say that's conceptually different than using like breath as an energizing, as an energizer, as it were.
Yeah. With these practices too, as they relate to consciousness, what do you see as the aim or the goal for these practices?
Yeah. I mean, of course, here it depends a lot on who you ask. If you ask Buddhists, they will say like, oh, well, it's about the ultimate liberation, right? Like just ending, becoming, death, rebirth, decay. From my perspective, I'm much more interested, at least in the short term, on like understanding consciousness, like scientifically, mathematically, computationally. So I tend to see these practices as ways of interfacing with a complex system, and really, they're kind of like. I gave a presentation recently about meditation as kind of like bioprompting, like similar to a large language model. I would make the claim, right, that like for a lot of people, they underestimate like the intelligence and the capabilities of large language models because they don't explore like really prompting them in strange or exotic, or like they don't push them to kind of their limits, right? If you're only asking ChatGPT about like recipes, right, like you're not going to realize it's actually capable of just so much more. I guess like just to give a hint of like, what you can do with these systems is like you can ask it to say, come up with a theory of literature that combines differential geometry and string theory, and like it will come up with some like amazing concepts for how to make sense of literature that you would never learn in English class, but presumably they're actually adding to the bulk of like interesting ideas to use to analyze literary text. I think like the same with meditation. Like I tend to think of like different breath work, different visualization techniques, different mantras, and different like conceptual forms of meditation as ways of like prompting your system in ways that are just very unusual, right? And they reveal capabilities that are just not obvious because, for better or worse, the average person is kind of just prompting themselves in the same way they might prompt ChatGPT, right? Which is like a very narrow set of possible inputs.
Yeah. Andres, you seem to really appreciate the edge cases in a way that I've heard you speak about, as comparing it to like physics with being at a room temperature versus comparing physics at extremes. What are you getting from understanding these edge cases and trying things and prompting ChatGPT in strange ways?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess like, to further the analogy is like, if physicists only had kind of like laboratory measurements of systems ranging between 20 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius, there's a huge variety of phenomena they will just like absolutely never see, right? Like from like water vaporizing to chemical reactions to like the very exotic stuff that happens at super low temperatures, like if you cool down helium to very, very close to 0 degrees Kelvin, it becomes a quantum liquid called superfluid helium, liquid helium. And also, if you heat up things to like thousands of degrees Celsius, you achieve like plasma, which is, a completely different phase of matter and energy, completely different, dynamics. And so these are like really important hints for like what is actually the underlying nature of reality, right? Like you can get away with a model like, hey, the universe is just made of, atoms and forces. If all you're looking at is, the sort of like phenomena you have access to in a, middle school laboratory. But if you do have access to a particle accelerator, all of a sudden you can actually, build theories about what's the structure of a nucleus, and in what way different virtual particles interact with each other. And you can actually, see it and test it and verify your theories. I think it's, very much the same with consciousness, that for the vast majority of our history, at least the Western philosophical canon, it has really been just analyzing room temperature consciousness. And, whether it's like Kant or John Locke or Hume or like all of these, very big figureheads, it's not like they had access to like LSD or like advanced meditation or, like they just like weren't paying attention to that possibility or like what you could learn from it. And my sense is that, actually, a lot of the most the strongest pieces of information for understanding reality do come from these extremes, because they reveal the way in which the normal configuration is itself actually just a special case of like something much, much larger. One of the good analogies here, I would say, is, for example, like the wave particle quote unquote duality of matter, or like that you don't notice it unless you like go into very cold or like very hot regimes. Where it actually turns out that an electron, even a virus, like now there's actually like interferometry research on viruses actually like behave like quantum waves if you know how to measure them properly. Like the quantum behavior of matter, like it's actually at all scales. It's just like much easier to see in the very low scales and in various temperature regimes. And I think like the same with consciousness. If you start out with kind of like just room temperature consciousness, it's very easy to believe that, well, your brain is just a collection of atoms and molecules, and maybe that explains it all. But once you actually analyze some of these extreme states of consciousness, you realize actually there's a lot of really exotic wave-like qualities to consciousness, and what I call a holistic behavior in consciousness, which really requires a different ontology, or a different explanation space for like understanding what even is this.
So a different kind of consciousness that most people experience is dreaming. Mm-hmm. How do you think dreaming fits into this set of experiences that we're talking about?
Yeah, dreaming is actually, it's fascinating. There was a period of my life where I used to do lucid dreaming, like more or less often. Another adjacent phenomena is sleep paralysis, which, for a better or worse, I suffer from like relatively often, like maybe once every 2 weeks. I know people who have it like way worse than I have, but I do think those are like really important, very worthwhile examples of like other states of consciousness from which we can learn from. I don't think they're like as helpful as like some of the other states that we're paying attention to, for a reason I'll explain in a second. But I would say that like even just dreaming does tell you something about the nature of consciousness that you wouldn't have guessed if you had just analyzed kind of like normal waking consciousness. And in particular, that is the fact, I would argue, that you never actually experience the world directly. Like all you ever experience is kind of like a mini world simulation inside your brain. It sounds very trippy and strange when you first kind of like start to think about this, but a picture that maybe is kind of helpful is like, if you know, like in Men in Black, there's this particular alien that is actually, he opens his face and it turns out like there's a little guy inside, controlling the robotic body. I think it's actually kind of like that. Like we are actually kind of a tiny mini theater or like diorama, like close to the center of the brain, maybe the thalamus, in a resonance state with the limbic system and the cortex. and that's all that you ever actually experience directly. And so like when you're dreaming, that kind of makes sense, right? Like your senses, as it were, are shut down. You're not really processing your senses in the same way, definitely not with the same attention as we usually do. But you can still have like really rich, very conscious, very colorful experiences, which kind of like throws out the window the idea that, consciousness arises at the interface between the physical world and your brain. I mean, there's a lot of theories that kind of like believe that. One of them, for example, being not to straw man it too much, but like something like enactivism. People who believe that actually consciousness arises in the interaction between your body and the physical world, and it's like fully embodied and so on. But it's like, okay, but what about dreaming? Like dreaming seems to be throwing a wrench in the machinery of that kind of theory. That said, I don't consider like the phenomenology of dreaming actually in some sense like exotic enough to like really tell us like that much about consciousness. I mean, I consider something like Fabemio DMT states of consciousness much more informative because they're much more extreme, and you can see the relationship between like mathematical features and of the experience and like aspects of phenomenology in a way that is just not nearly as obvious, whether it's like waking dream, sleep paralysis, lucid dream or dreaming.
Yeah. Andres, I do want to get to talking about how emotion plays into this, but first, hearing you talk about so many different aspects to this question of consciousness just makes me wonder, how do you think about how you approach the question, where you put your time and energy, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I guide myself on the principles of QRI and its overall mission. I mean, that's kind of like something that, if I get too lost in outer space, as it were, like I very, I frequently ask myself, okay, like, is this actually like the relevant task I should be doing right now? And, we do have like we're ultimately like a mission-driven organization, and we do want to accomplish specific things. So like the overall framework that I use is as follows. So in terms of like objectives, like to interface with the world, like effects we want to have in the world, we have what we call like the 3 pillars of QRI. The 3 pillars of QRI are reduce extreme suffering. So we think for a number of reasons, extreme suffering is a underinvested in kind of like cause area as a general class, which I'd be very happy to unpack. The second pillar is increasing baseline. Like how can we find the ways to kind of like take our mood from like, okay, like kind of a little bit under the weather, a little bit kind of indifferent or neutral to, just like positive enough to like be productive and happy and engaging and prosocial. And then, the third pillar is how do we make accessible in a healthy and wholesome way to the world extremely blissful, pleasant, lovely states of consciousness. I tend to think of these 3 goals as very much my life mission, that I really want to make a dent in these directions, and I actually see them as entwined because if I only focus on intense suffering, actually that it's like a pretty depressing over time. And there was a period where like I that was like my main focus, and I almost burnt out. And it's very tricky. Some people can do it. Some people need to balance it out. The extremes of pleasure and happiness, I very much consider them as kind of like a very powerful motivator and unifier for people. It's like if you don't know that these like wonderful states of consciousness are possible and exist, right? Like you don't have kind of like skin in the game. You may not just care that much about like, okay, like how do we cooperate as humanity? How do we, there's just like no goal in mind for like where we could actually go. But once you get acquainted with some of these states, it's actually profoundly motivating, right? Like it makes you wake up in the morning saying like, okay, yes, there's actually something really worthwhile to work towards. And then, like the second pillar is really essential for like everyday productivity and follow through and showing up and all the things that, ultimately like make things work and matter. And then I hinted at this, but like the 3 disciplines through which we try to approach these goals are philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and neurotechnology. So whenever I'm maybe like straying a little bit into outer space, I tend to think like, okay, like where in this matrix am I actually making progress, and in what way this project is actually like helping pursue these goals. And then at a higher level, the three missions of QRI, and this is something that is official. I'm very very happy about that. Is first of all is like we want to map the state space of consciousness, understand like what is out there, what are like the possible experiences, and so to the extent that the frameworks and the mathematical models that we come up with are helpful in that task, like I consider that like a worthwhile use of time. The second one is reverse engineer, the mathematics of consciousness, and in particular, of valence, pleasure and pain. And then finally, applying this information for the sake of the benefit of all sentient beings. And also that's an important caveat that like I'm not saying like for the benefit of just humans, or for the benefit of even just like, let's say, a particular ethnicity or something like that. Is like, no, it's for all sentient beings. Like I actually think that's a very important aspect of ethics and coordination, is something that I call team consciousness. That we really have to kind of like have a commitment for like, it really is like all sentient beings, because I mean, at a deep sense, you could say we're all one consciousness in a certain sense. And so, the suffering of all beings matter. And yeah, so like these are kind of like my guiding principles. I wouldn't say that, I'm like always like making progress in them, like 24/7, but I do try my best to like be relevant for these goals.
Okay. So I'm picturing your grid, your 3x3 of reducing suffering, increasing the baseline, and extreme states of pleasure against the neuroscience, the neurotechnology, and the philosophy. Do you aim evenly at the spaces on that grid, or do you see them as we need to knock out the philosophy before we can do the next one? We need to improve the baseline before we can get the extremes. How do you see it in order?
Yeah, this is a very excellent question. I think in practice, I do spread out my efforts quite evenly because of the belief. I mean, I would argue probably founded that they're like synergistic. So
okay,
they actually really help each other out. I mean, for example, what I hinted at is like, if you give access to people, you find like reliable ways of experiencing like super pleasant states of consciousness that insulates against burnout from like working on extreme suffering, for example. If you help people with extreme suffering, then you actually get like a lot of help and support and a good faith. Like if you've kind of rescued people from hell realms, they're very, very thankful and grateful, and so they become part of like the movement, as it were. And yes, if you make progress on how to increase baseline, then you have more productive people. So they all really benefit from each other. I would say in terms of like the disciplines, we definitely had a uneven, I would say, like allocation of resources over the years. QRI very much started just kind of in the philosophy front. And like if you go way back to like the ancient origins of QRI, like 2014, 2015, where it was really just a collection of blogs. It really was like mostly just philosophy of mind, right? It's like, okay, like how do we solve the binding problem? What kind of mathematical formalism could consciousness, be described with, and so on. I would say that like, the neuroscience element only really entered the picture in 2019. And then neurotechnology about like 2021. And since then, I would say it's kind of like allocating different personnel, different collaborators to different disciplines, but always in communication and trying to find synergies between them.
Okay. So Andres, I said we're going to get to emotions. I'm still getting there. I think maybe we're going to get there kind of backwards. You said that you could unpack more how you deal with the problem of suffering. I'd like to know more about how you deal with that. A lot of this show is talking about people who are in states of suffering, or how to sort of reflect on periods of suffering. So how do you approach that problem?
Yes. A couple of pointers. So the most important pointer, pragmatically speaking, is that one of the key pieces of research from QRI is something that first came out as, we called it the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain. It started out actually as a review of the literature plus like some scientific arguments, plus analyzing like new data. In particular, I ran a survey where I was interviewing people to get a sense of like what are like their top 3 most pleasant and their top 3 most unpleasant experiences in their life, and then like how they rank relative to each other, how they compare against each other, what is the relative ratio of intensity, between, let's say, like the number 1 worst and the second worst, or the number 1 best and the second best. And we ran a lot of statistical analysis on this data set, and it became really clear that both pleasure and pain are not linear scales, right? Like that intuitively, right? Like you may think like, well, 4 out of 10 pain is like twice as bad as like 2 out of 10, or, like a 10 out of 10, like mystical experience is like twice as good as a 5 out of 10, just hanging out with your girlfriend sort of thing. And that just doesn't seem to be the case like at all. Like it's much more that like as you go up the reported pain level or pleasure level, the actual intensity of the state and just how much attention it's co-opting and the energy of it grows exponentially, or something that approximates an exponential distribution. And if you were to kind of like plot the intensities of experience in the world, it would follow what we call a long tail distribution. I mean, this is something that shows up in a lot of like natural phenomena. Like if you look at, for example, avalanches, right? Like most countries have no avalanches at all, right? And then there's like a few, percentage of countries that have like enough mountains with enough, snow that you do have a few avalanches here and there. And then you have like some countries that are kind of like mass, super full of avalanches, like Switzerland or or Austria, just like, and the reason is, because the weather conditions and the conditions on the ground, like the amount of mountains, and the way in which the winds collide with each other and the fronts and so on, multiply each other, right? Like these are like factors that they're not just like additive, but like they multiply when you make them interact. The same thing with, for example, like the size of asteroids, right? Like there's a lot of like a lot of like tiny rocks out there in the solar system that are like just like very, very tiny, the size of a grain of rice or something like that. And when you see a shooting star, is usually actually a very, very tiny rock. But then every once in a while, you get something like, the Chicxulub asteroid, something that actually kills the entire, most dinosaurs, except the birds. But yeah, this is like the sort of thing that that happens. And from our perspective, I mean, if you think of like the nervous system as kind of like a natural ecosystem of a lot of patterns and different conditions, it is the sort of thing that, the factors are like multiplicative. So it is not the case that like if you were to plot the intensity of pain over the course of days, it's going to look like a Gaussian distribution, like a normal distribution. It's very much going to look like the size of avalanches in the world. And so let's say like on a normal day, maybe you have a little bit of back pain or a little bit of a leg pain, but then you have like kidney stones. And then, the kidney stone is like 10 out of 10 pain. Sometimes people say it's even worse. It depends. And even the intensity of the pain of kidney stones itself follows a long tail distribution. So like the worst kidney stones are like orders of magnitude worse than like the median one. And this piece of information is something that, once I kind of like, ran the analysis and like understood that like, hey, like this makes sense of a lot of phenomenology, a lot of like previous literature, like really, really makes sense when you interpret it through these like long tails, through this like logarithmic scale. It completely changes like ethical priorities. And in fact, it makes you see that how, the world and, econometric approaches to reducing suffering have a massive blind spot, which is that, for example, like how they determine which interventions like matter the most usually is through something like, for example, quality adjusted life years, where they're trying to maximize the amount of life that people will live in a good state, right? Like in a healthy, social, functional state. So they add a little bit of a discount to, for example, years lived in disability, something like that. Of course, controversial, and ethicists, there's disagreements about like whether this is ethical or not, but it's very standard these days. and is like what most effective altruists actually like, kind of like how they see the world. But all of a sudden, if you realize like, hey, hold on a second, like suffering itself follows this like extremely skewed long tail distribution, you realize that quality adjusted life years as an instrument is just, it makes those phenomena completely invisible, right? Like a kidney stone or a cluster headache or various of these extreme forms of suffering, they just don't show up. Like they're just invisible from this perspective. So for us at QRI, like a lot of the kind of like the thrust on the side of reducing extreme suffering has been on the importance of like getting good at actually quantifying, the absolute values, the actual intensity of these experiences, and essentially building a map of where in the world do we actually have like these intense forms of suffering, and how do we tackle them, pragmatically with urgent, effective action. And it is essentially from that strain of thinking that last year, for example, we created an offshoot organization that essentially is like going to become its own nonprofit. Currently, it's under the umbrella of QRI, but we're in the process of separating it so it can like really focus on it, which is called Cluster Free, which is an organization dedicated to providing information and pushing the envelope on the legal front for when it comes to effective therapies for cluster headaches. One of the key reasons is that cluster headaches has surfaced as one of kind of these like global urgent priorities that other people are just not really capable of seeing it because of the lack of effective frameworks. And I mean, the ethical case for focusing on something like cluster headaches is really, really, really strong, because it's not one of these situations like, I don't know, let's say like cancer, where like you have to say like, well, we just need to find a lot of money to make a lot of foundational research, and like maybe we will figure out like whether there's a solution to this or not. In the case of cluster headaches, we pretty much already have like a therapy that like works for most likely like over 80 or like 90% of people, and that is vaporized DMT. I mean, this is something that really surprised me when I was interviewing people in 2019 about this problem. That people kind of like know that LSD and psilocybin can like help prevent cluster headaches, and it works better than like modern medicine and whatever they prescribe you, except oxygen. It's more or less comparable to high throughput oxygen, and I would recommend in general to have like both an oxygen tank and something like LSD for treating cluster headaches. But when we interviewed a bunch of people, those who had tried DMT in particular, that said like, no, this actually works even way better. And including now Bob Wald, which is like the head of the Cluster Busters, is like the first global organization against cluster headaches. Has tried like 80 different therapies. Most of them just do nothing for the pain. And he said that, like of everything he has tried, like DMT is like an outlier. It just works way better. I mean, we're talking about a situation where a pain that is like 10 out of 10, or like, people actually describe it as like 15 out of 10, and it's just inconceivably bad. And it's not only like physical pain, it's also like psychological, spiritual. It's just like, the worst of the worst, just all combined. If you smoke or vaporized just like 3 milligrams of DMT, which is sub-perceptual, it's not even like a psychedelic dose. It's just maybe colors look a little bit brighter. Maybe it feels a little bit wobbly, but that's it. The pain can go from 10 out of 10 to 0 out of 10 in the span of like 10 seconds. So, and it just usually doesn't come back. I mean, it depends on the person. Some people need more. Some people need some like repeated. But like the typical case is like these very, very tiny doses have this massive, massive effect. So anyway, this is like one of these cases where, okay, like the philosophy of mind, where we were like thinking from first principles, like, okay, like what kind of distribution might Valence, follow, led to like finding specific cause area, and then finding a particular cure for it, and then actually, building an organization for it, and like trying to really make a dent in that front. And I mean, right now, Cluster Free is being, if you see global letter of support. There's signatories like Peter Singer, Jeffrey Miller, Scott Alexander, Daniel Ingram. Like a lot of like big figureheads in our in our community are like fully in support of this. And yeah, I mean, essentially one of my missions in Mexico, I'm going to be doing a retreat in Mexico. So yeah, like talking to politicians actually there to to find like the fastest way in which we can potentially like legalize DMT for this particular purpose.
Wow. Yeah, I had a high school teacher growing up who had cluster headaches, and at first I thought it was maybe trigeminal neuralgia, and he went through all kinds of treatments, and he was looking for anything that would make the pain go away. And I remember he said he was taking lots of narcotics and things like that, and it wasn't hitting it. So very interesting that you found this. And let me see if I understand your process. So you're saying that in doing the philosophical work, you recognized a gap in the way that pain was measured, and that it's really logarithmic by your understanding rather than a linear scale from 1 to 10. And then in doing that, then the example of the cluster headaches stood out, and then you look deeper into what might actually effectively treat that, and now it's come to a nonprofit, policy, treatment, all of that.
Yes.
What a ride. Wow.
Yeah.
We'll have to put links in the description for people to check out, especially anybody dealing with cluster headaches. They'd be looking for any kind of solution. So, we'll put something in the description.
Yeah.
Andres, anything else on that? It seems like you have something else.
Yeah. Just a tiny little bit of extra word on that organization and push, which is that we have a couple extended videos and also like an extended guide for how to use DMT for cluster headaches, which you can look up. I would recommend sharing it with anybody who has this condition. It also seems to work for migraines, although it's not as well established, at least not in our circles. But we suspect actually probably one of the most viable ways to bring this into the world is actually to first essentially get like through clinical trials using DMT for migraines, because there's a much larger population of people who suffer from them. And then like the other thing is I would highly encourage anybody who listens to like sign our global open letter in clusterfree.org. And finally, yes, if you actually know somebody with this condition, and let's say like accessibility of the substance is a problem, or if like like there's like legal issues, like there's a lot of people who suffer from it, but like they have like a family, or maybe there's a common situation of they have like divorced, let's say like their partner, and if they were to know that they take illegal substances, then like that is actually problematic from the point of view of like custody and like things like that. So like one way around it is there is this legal retreat setting in Mexico called Eulocinia Retreat, where is the only place in the world where essentially they use like mushrooms and DMT specifically for like pain disorders. And so it's a place where you can like do it with a lot of support, very and very, very good accommodations and very, very high success rate. So super important practical advice for anybody who might need it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for doing that work and for sharing it. To kind of get closer to the core of my show, I think I want to get to know you a little bit better. When we had set this up, you had mentioned that maybe you had seen some of my videos. I'm just wondering, where did your interest happen to have the internet serve you something from Brad Carr?
I mean, if I remember, it might have been a video on like the psychological makeup of narcissism, I think.
Yeah.
What else? I think you've also interviewed people in the kind of like philosophy of mind space, but I forget exactly whom. But like I remember like seeing like, okay, there's kind of this like interface or like Venn diagram overlap of like kind of like interested in psychological architectures and then also like philosophy of mind and potentially kind of like wellness in general, like emotional wellness. So yeah.
Okay, great. So since we're on the same page about that, so a lot of people who get into relationships with people who are extremely manipulative, abusive, they're going through a kind of suffering, but it's sort of hard to understand or explain. One of the most common things is cognitive dissonance, but to a level that's considered almost traumatic. It's like your mind can't make sense of the relationship that you're in. It seems like someone is, say, your husband, but also is somehow sort of tormenting you. And it's like, he loves me, he hates me. And holding that in your mind at the same time becomes exhausting and it becomes consuming for people. And so with that kind of suffering, it also seems that it diminishes the consciousness. I've been through something like this, and I felt like I was often in a haze. Like my days were just sort of gray. Some people compare it to being almost in a cloud. What do you think of the issue of consciousness and this kind of experience of what we'd call narcissistic abuse?
Yeah. Might take me a second to like load up all of my thoughts.
Yeah, it's a lot, and I realized we had to lay some groundwork and kind of talk together, and now we're still going to find it, I think.
Yeah. I have in my Substack, I have a little bit of a provocative essay called Dealing with Narcissists.
Okay.
Which is it's kind of like a comprehensive list of approaches for like how to deal with like the four main types of narcissism, which, if I recall correctly, is like grandiose, communal. Oh, there's like 5: grandiose, communal, covert, benign, and malignant. And you need kind of like different approaches for each of them, and like the reward architecture is like subtly different.
Yeah.
It really seems to me that like the most important like axis of development is emotional self-sufficiency. That like if you still have kind of like the need for like validation from them, from like somebody who suffers from this condition, like they will always, be grabbing you in one way or another. But like if you really have to kind of like go beyond the need to like show them that they're wrong, or like trying to establish a common, consensus reality with them, because that itself is kind of the bait, like the thing that keeps you trapped. Is like they dangle the possibility that like, okay, maybe we will find a common ground or understanding as kind of like the possible price of continuing to engage. But in fact, usually they get off. I mean, they find it rewarding to not delivering that common, common sense of reality. I would say like, a lot of, maybe the haze that you're describing is kind of like learned helplessness of having tried in hundreds of different ways to try to find like some shared sense of reality, and like failing at it, and really noticing that the game is like rigged against you. It is especially terrible, for people who grow up with, under those conditions. If both of your parents suffer from various forms of narcissism, it's like, okay, like that was your reality from the very beginning. And I know people who are in that condition, and takes many years of therapy to essentially be able to like validate your own reality, to not constantly be wondering like, am I the one who's actually messed up? Am I the one who's selfish? Am I the one who is gaslighting the other? Phenomenologically, something I've observed with people with a narcissistic personality disorder is that their attention structure is different. I tend to model our attention as having more or less, this is speculative, a very QRI type of way of thinking. But I would actually argue that like on any given moment in time, we have like something like 7 attention streams. Like we're kind of like paying attention to like 7 different things at once. You can kind of think of this as, imagine kind of like 7 bees in a kind of like hive, little hive.
Okay.
When you're reading a book, it's something like, well, 3 of those bees are kind of like sitting on the book, but the other 4 bees are kind of like scouting around, looking for opportunities, for dangers, for things that might be appealing, or like, okay, like wondering about like what's for dinner, like that sort of thing. The same at a party, right? Like you're talking to somebody, okay, a few of your bees are like concentrating on them. There's like other bees like scouting around for like other social opportunities, or like, okay, like are there like any threats around? Advanced concentration meditation is all about kind of like getting all the bees to coalesce together. And there's like a phase transition where like, okay, you become just like one beam of concentrated attention. Usually actually that's like a very advanced stage. Even just having like, 4 or 5 of the bees kind of like sitting together already, changes your experience quite a lot. I think like what happens with people with narcissistic personality disorder is like they have something like 2 or 3 of those bees, as it were, like permanently like stuck to their sense of self. And so like any information whatsoever that they consume, they don't analyze it from the point of view of like, hey, is this true? Or like, does this matter to others? Or is this like relevant for like others? It is like, how does it affect my sense of self first and foremost? And that is kind of like a funnel through which everything gets channeled. And you can almost like feel it. It's kind of like in the structure of their being, in the structure of their cognition, that it's impossible to present information in a neutral way, right? Like, because they will always kind of like pre-filter it by just how does this affect me and my false self, as they say.
Yeah. Wow. The image of the bees, I can see it, and it's bringing back so many memories. That's funny. You mentioned validating one's reality. Now, for you as the consciousness guy, how do we validate our own reality? I wonder what you would see as a good way to do that, and especially if you see that as a way to sort of break out of the loop of being manipulated.
Yeah. Yes. One important, I think, like conceptual tool is the idea of winning and winning in so one thing is like to win a game, another thing is to set a game. In some sense, if you are the one who chooses what game to play, you have a lot more power than like even just like being good at a particular game, right? And one of the like classic manipulative techniques, people with personality disorders, but just more generally, is something we might describe as like frame control. That like is not so much that they're like particularly skilled at like playing social games. They're rather like very skilled at introducing a pre-existing kind of like biased frame where the game is rigged.
Yes.
And one of the people who are like more empathetic or kind of like people pleasing by nature, is kind of like your impulse is to, as a favor, is to accept other people's frames, because that's usually how you converge on a shared reality. If you think of like people who are like very successful diplomats, and people who are like very very good at solving interpersonal disagreements, so, they start out by probing, okay, like how are you seeing reality? And first and foremost, it kind of like providing some space for that. It's like, okay, like, look, I understand this is how you see reality. Let's give some credence to that, but let's not be too attached. Let's not be too clinging to it. Here's like other possible frames. And of course, like, the best type of relationships is where you can essentially have like multiple frames coexist and not have any one of them necessarily having to dominate the other or override the other. And this can go like can be very subtle, can also be very very deep, like even just like particular wording. So like the tone of voice, the way in which you introduce a topic or a problem, very often already kind of like comes with an implicit frame. And typically, with people with narcissism, the implicit frame is one of a zero sum mentality. When it comes to winners and losers, there can only be like one loser, one winner. And then the other very important factor is the subtle but pretty much like constant vibe and frame that they are owed something like that life has been unfair, and it has been unfair against them, right? Like, so whatever, like if you want to engage in their reality, you have to like subtly accept that like they have been like treated unfairly to begin with, which is, obviously like it's unlikely in many of these cases, just given like, okay, like how could this possibly be the case like all throughout your life? I think especially in the case of I was thinking like in the case of like covert narcissism. Now, the memories are coming back. It's you can actually analyze like the issue very much as a dynamic system that because most people are like empathetic, we care about other people's emotions, we try to make other people feel good. Usually the way the covert narcissist will operate is via kind of like emotional volatility as a threat, as a kind of like underlying kind of like a nuclear weapon. It's kind of like, okay, like there's always that threat of like escalation that they may just go completely crazy if you say the wrong thing. And so let's say like in a family setting or like in a work setting or a social environment where you're all trying to co-inhabit, one of the things a covert narcissist will do is constantly kind of like share their micro emotional reactions to like the things that are happening, what people are saying, in a way that has like two properties. First, it is there's plausible deniability. Like, if you say something that maybe kind of like attacks their ego a little bit, they might say like, ugh, or like they might, but then if you inquire, they might say like, well, no, I just had a stomach ache, or I just didn't sleep very well last night, and just like there's always this plausible deniability. Of course, the social effect is actually, people are perceiving, that they're like in a bad state, and is clearly in response to this, even though there's no way to prove it. And then the other thing is that it is kind of like providing a on-ramp to the emotional escalation where they may, essentially like go completely crazy and destroy the entire dynamic if things don't go their way. In particular, like with covert narcissism, I think like they do this essentially to make sure that their frame is the one that is dominant. For example, this is maybe a very very specific example, but like you can generalize it. Is like let's say it's very common, I guess, in the kind of like the arts or like in acting and things like that, when somebody feels like they're actually they should have been the next Brad Pitt or whatever, but life circumstances were such that like they didn't go to the right school because for some unfair reason, whatever. So they feel like they're like this like massive talent that the world is just not utilizing. If you talk, about like your own artistic judgments, like, okay, like, oh yeah, this actor is wonderful, or like, I think this play was fantastic, without checking, with them first about like what they think, that is extremely threatening to them, right? Like, because you're kind of like playing the role of being the judge in a place where like instinctively they're supposed to be the ultimate judge, right? Like, because they are the ones who have this, world-class talent that is completely unrecognized. Sorry, these are just like some random disparate examples, maybe to illustrate the point. Yeah.
Oh, it's tremendous. Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking more about your metaphor of the bees now too, and it makes me think of other things around this. So if your idea is that maybe someone who's highly narcissistic, it's like their bees of attention are too focused or never really let go of focus on their sense of self. Now, at the same time, it's said that these people lack empathy, that there's something going on, perhaps even at a structural level in the brain. So I wonder if perhaps that is the same phenomenon, if perhaps what you would think of the idea that maybe the lack of empathy that might even be rooted in the brain allows for the bees to always be on the sense of self.
Yeah, I mean the extent to which the bees are being drawn and captured by the sense of self is co-opting resources that usually would be necessary to be able to have proper levels of empathy. I mean, empathy is like one of these things that is not like a on or off situation. I would say like there's probably no ceiling to empathy. I mean, it is a long tail. It's another kind of, there's like a logarithmic scales of like empathetic understanding, and empathy, it's enormously cognitively demanding, right? Like people who are like really empathetic, socially intelligent, it's on some level, it's almost like they're solving like a super complex mathematical problem, except that is for like social relationships, and how is this person going to feel about what this person feels, and recursively, and keeping track of a lot of things. Like if you go to a party, like people who are hyper empathetic, they can keep track of like everybody's like states, and also how everybody's states are like affecting each other, and then also like the group state, and they might know exactly what to say to make everybody happy, or how to. Now, one thing though is that it's very easy to create kind of like the false appearance of like either a beneficial or a detrimental change of state in a group or in an individual, which is why like you can kind of like fake empathy. I mean, like, to be genuinely helpful, to a group of people or to a couple, to an individual, is very difficult, right? Like, you need a lot of state. You need to really represent what is going on in their life, what is going on emotionally. Even just like, okay, how sleepy are they? But to be flattering to somebody, it doesn't take that much effort. You don't need that much. You just like take something that, okay, society kind of says it's positive, and you just like pretend like, oh yeah, you have that all the way up to 11, right? So love bombing, in the moment, it actually might feel like, oh, this person really gets me, right? But actually, like, there's very little modeling, right? Like, they have just a cartoon of who you are. They're not actually, they don't have like a 3-dimensional representation of who you are. And then also when it comes to like emotional damage and emotional threats, it doesn't take I mean, we all dislike pain. We all dislike our reputation being damaged, right? Like, we all suffer from thirst and hunger. Like, it's not that hard to figure out how to like emotionally, psychologically punish somebody. So it's also not something for which you require all that much empathy. Which it's kind of like paradoxical that to be. It's a lot easier to cause destruction than to actually help, which is one of the problems here.
Mm-hmm. Easier to cause destruction and easier to flatter, to charm, and to sort of ingratiate than to actually be connected to a person.
Yeah, which I would argue is another form of destruction because you're kind of a like you're taking a quality of somebody who that could very much benefit from like cultivation and earnest praise, and okay, you're giving like a fake version of the same, and that itself can be traumatizing, right? Like, after you go through a narcissistic relationship where they loved bombed you in a particular way, you don't even know if you actually have those good qualities or not afterwards. Right? Like, it's like, what? I mean, they were faking it. So like, am I actually good at this? And it's, that can be like really discombobulating, very disorienting for people.
Right. It would distort your sense of self. And if you're expecting someone to reflect things back to you honestly, then you lose that.
Yeah.
So Andres, a lot of what we're talking about is maybe a lack of having a conscience. I wonder, how important do you think a conscience is to being conscious? I mean, could these behaviors be unconscious? Could somebody just be sort of going through them like habits? Is that even relevant?
Yeah. I mean, I guess if we take the Buddhist view,
Okay.
like, a lot of the problem here is one of delusion, like just not understanding reality, not understanding experience very well. I mean, in the case of narcissism is kind of like an extreme example of something that is pretty ubiquitous, except maybe like highly realized meditation masters. I'll describe it as follows. So I guess for those who are not familiar with this concept, there is this concept in neural networks and machine learning called autoencoder. It's a pretty cool kind of like very, very basic or like introductory idea in neural networks, which is in order to kind of like model a whole set of like images or audio or pictures of people or something like that, what you can do is you train a neural network that essentially reads the entire picture and then it goes through layers that have increasingly fewer neurons until you get to kind of like this like bottleneck that then becomes like unfolded across layers of neurons that become increasingly larger. And essentially what you trained this network to do is to take an image and then try to reproduce the same image, but having gone through this bottleneck. So effectively what this forces is creating kind of like a low dimensional representation of the image that captures as much of the information as possible, right? So, these networks typically will, come up with kind of like, rather than representing a nose in terms of like all its pixels, it might have just like one neuron that like represents, okay, like there's a nose present, right? Like, and maybe another neuron for like where the nose is, right? It's like a very kind of like a pixelated way of representing the image. And sometimes they can be actually like really compelling. Sometimes it's very hard to tell that like an image is reconstructed versus the original. But it's very, very convenient to actually have these like internal, like these simplified low dimensional representations, because it's a way of capturing a very, very broad, high-dimensional state at a glance, right? It's like you can say like, okay, this is the picture of a person looking to the left, and you can just like read that through like that, where the tiny bottleneck, dimensional bottlenecks is to be found. I mean, I would argue that the sense of self is roughly like doing this to our experience, that our sense of self is kind of this like low dimensional representation of how you are doing as an entire organism, right? So, okay, like for example, your reputation, right? Like your reputation is this very complex, high dimensional thing, but it gets encoded in just kind of like your sense of what is your social standing, right? And that feels a certain way, or like it has a certain quality. And it's not a very high dimensional quality, right? Like it almost kind of like has just a few dimensions. It's like, oh, how am I doing with family? How am I doing with friends? How am I doing at work? Yeah, etc. But here is the main problem. Like if you use your sense of self as a thermostat, or like as a kind of like a thermometer, that you check on it to kind of like have at a glance how am I doing? That actually can be like very helpful. It saves you on a lot of compute. You don't have to constantly, be going through your entire life to figure out, okay, how am I doing? You just check your sense of self. It's like, okay, I'm doing okay. I don't need to make a big correction. But as it is the case in many dynamic systems like this, there is a potential failure mode, and that is where you start trying to optimize the signal as opposed to the thing that signal is supposed to be measuring. In economics, they call it the Goodhart's law, right? Like where in a communist in communist companies, like in the Soviet Union, right? Like if the metric for like how well a factory is doing is the number of shoes it makes, right? It's going to start making like a lot of shoes of very low quality with like very thin soils, and like they break apart very quickly, right? If instead it's something like, oh, how many how many soils do you have, like, or how much how many kilograms of rubber are you using? Then the factory is going to be pumping out a lot of shoes that are just like very thick soles, right? Like very, very thick. So like the moment you kind of like set one metric and you say like, yeah, this is your metric for success. So this is like what you're supposed to be doing. Oftentimes you miss out on like, hey, like what the point was to begin with. And my sense is that with narcissism is like either, a combination of genetics and social conditioning and environment made it so that they truly believe that the thing to optimize is their sense of self. And they become kind of like disconnected from the fact that, hey, the sense of self is just meant to be a reflection of this like much more complex, higher dimensional situation. And the problem though is that, the sense of self, just as these other metrics for how many shoes you're making, can be manipulated, right? Like you can pretend that the sense of self is like greater or more important or like bigger, more robust than it really is. And there you get into these, very unfortunate situations where like, the communal narcissist is supposedly having a perfect family, but actually under the hood, everybody in the family feels miserable. They're just like putting up a mask to like maximize, how good that collective sense of self like looks like. But yeah, I mean, at a very, very deep level, I would actually say that, this is like a delusion. It's like the system is kind of broken. It's just failing to understand that this is a representation and it's not the real thing. And it's like something that we all have to greater or lesser extents. It's just that with narcissism, it kind of like crossed a threshold where like it really acquired a life of its own. And now it's just the fake sense of self really taking control of everything and just not being capable of updating.
So within this model, if it is this optimizing for too narrow a metric, and these people already maybe have an impairment in empathizing with others, could it be that they would unconsciously be abusive of others, or would they still be conscious of that act?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is one of these situations, kind of like what I was mentioning early on. Like, it will be part of their field of awareness. I mean, I do think like they're having some texture that of their experience that is like representing other people's feelings. It is just that it's not cashing out into, their actual embodied sense feeling bad. It's more like they're just keeping track of it, like in the same way that we keep track of a cartoon character in a screen, not necessarily like actually embodying it. Whereas, no, the typical person with emotional, cognitive empathy, if they see somebody who, is like suffering, they actually physiologically feel it, right? Like it dysregulates you in an internal way, which I don't think is the case with extreme cases of narcissism.
Mm-hmm. I wonder about sadism. If somebody does this sort of thing, is hurtful to another person, and is taking pleasure in it, then at that point, what do you think about a situation like that?
Yeah. Actually, I'm not sure, because I don't personally know that many people with like severe, sadism disorders. As opposed to like, I know several people with quite significant narcissism. I've been able to kind of study a little bit from afar. But no, my sense is not that people with sadism like literally are like enjoying other suffering. I think like there's the circuit's a little bit more complex. I think actually what's happening is like what they're enjoying is the sense of empowerment of their sense of self that comes with like the capacity to inflict damage. Like it's, just that with like grandiose narcissists, oftentimes like it's I don't think it's like the case in general that they enjoy the destruction that they cause, but they not for its own sake. Rather, they enjoy the feeling of power that comes with it. And so, like if they could see a different way of acquiring the same level of power, they would probably choose it. Like in fact, I think like one possible lens of making sense of a lot of these disorders is that we kind of have like a tiered kind of like natural hierarchy for like what kind of power we want and we prefer. And in general, most people, I think, like do prefer like the sense of power that comes from like being able to empower others and makes them feel good and give them good lives. But if you don't really have like the psychological makeup to be able to like model others and really understand how to help them, it's almost kind of like those options are just off the table. So like, okay, like you're not going to be able to have like power by helping others. The next best thing that there is like, okay, you might be able to have like power by having the threat of hurting others, or in some cases, actually hurting others. But it feels to me like, it's fundamentally a different drive than just the actual suffering of others. I think that's probably very rare.
So it sounds like it's more of a indicator of a competitive success?
Yeah.
Wow. And I've heard you talk about meaning and emotion and valence as well. And we just used the word earlier in this discussion, but we didn't really get into it. This seems relevant too. If you lack empathy, then you wouldn't necessarily feel the same sense of meaning from helping others if you're not as connected to those people. Now, you could feel it if you get accolades for it, or if you are seen as superior, or if you have control of somebody and you are telling them to do things to make their life better, then you might feel superior. But how important do you think is empathy in valence and meaning?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll provide a little bit of a background to kind of contextualize. So valence is how good or bad an experience feels. It's a very broad term. Usually it's used in affective psychology, people who study emotions, but also, in the context of like pain and pleasure. The reason I use valence as opposed to, let's say, happiness, or let's say like meaning or like pain, is that it's a more general term. Maybe kind of like an example here is that, like a particular experience can have like a lot of different elements on many different levels. You can have like physical pain, but be like emotionally joyful. You might be listening to beautiful music, but like really need to go to the bathroom at the same time, right? Or we have like these complexities, right? But on the whole, there's always some element of, okay, am I okay existing given this experience, right? And if the amount of kind of like pain and discomfort, whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, goes above a certain threshold, your judgment about whether you should exist like flips over, right? Like if you're in intense suffering, typically it's like, no, I would rather be asleep. I would rather be under anesthesia. I don't want to be conscious, right? Like, so kind of like valence is ultimately comes down to that kind of like judgment. Is like, am I okay existing? And if the answer is no, like that means you're below the hedonic zero, or like valence is zero. Now, I do think it's a very important concept because it unifies these different sets of experience in a way that I feel like a lot of people and a lot of philosophers try to kind of like make a hierarchy out of. I mean, it is very common for people to say, well, sure, pain might be bad in a certain way, but like what really matters is like meaning. So like, it's okay if you have a lot of pain as long as you have like a sense of meaning, right? And they kind of think of it as kind of like a categorically, almost ontologically different thing that, you can endure huge amounts of, discomfort as long as there's meaning, there's no problem. Well, within kind of the valence paradigm, I would actually ask, okay, like when you're experiencing this sense of meaning, this sense of mattering, this sense of like embeddedness in reality, or care, or all of these other markers that are correlated with the subjective feeling of meaning, how is that manifesting in your experience? And I would say that, yeah, if we're honest with ourselves, it ultimately does cash out into some kind of like pleasant or comfortable form of embodiment or vibration in the organism. That like the sense of profound meaning is not like an abstract kind of like symbolic thing that is happening. It's actually like an embodied vibrational state. And like to feel profoundly meaningful without also feeling some level of joy is kind of like a contradiction in terms. So like nobody says, as it were, like, oh, I feel like my life is profoundly meaningful, but I feel like shit everywhere in my body. Right? Like it usually doesn't happen, right? Like the meaning is kind of like the source of light at the end of the tunnel that like makes you feel good despite the hardship. I would say like, okay, like emotions are also like, another facet of valence, very broadly, and even kind of like existential feelings. And maybe the best analogy that I can come up with is in analyzing like music, right? Because a musical piece, if you listen to like a 1 second excerpt or like a 3 second excerpt, let's say like Tchaikovsky or Wagner or I don't know, like a romantic musician, you will notice like, okay, like in some regions of the spectrum, it can be like very consonant and very smooth and very like pleasant and the sort of thing that you could play in the background for like hours without irritation. But maybe it's been counterbalanced with other regions in the spectrum that is like maybe harsh or chaotic and unpredictable and spiky. Yet on the whole, like the overall kind of like musical episode in your consciousness tilts either in the direction of like, oh, this is something that I can tolerate listening to or can enjoy listening to, or something that I would actually rather like shut down, right? Like it, it's kind of like the same, right? Like that. For a musical piece, you can actually decompose it into like different frequencies, different frequency ranges. So you can actually say something very precise, like, hey, like the drums are in a dissonant state, but the very high frequencies are like in a consonant state. I would argue that when it comes to an entire experience, it is very similar to like a moment of musicality, or like a moment of a musical experience. That pain, like physical pain and physical pleasure, kind of like physical senses of like rapture and warmth and so on. Those are kind of like the high frequencies. Those are like the details, the very fine level patterns that are like populating your experience. Whereas something like your emotions are like intermediate level frequencies that like they're more delocalized. As you go down in frequencies, in waves, you go from like these very sharp kind of like spikes to these kind of like more distributed patterns. So while it makes sense to say like, hey, like my pain is like precisely here, I'm having a precise like spike of sensation here. Joy, for example, is usually a distributed thing. You're not going to say like, the tip of my finger is joyful, right? It's more like, no, joy is kind of this wave-like harmony, throughout my body. And then even deeper, something like your sense of meaning or connection to the divine or existential feelings, those would be kind of like the lowest frequencies. Those are kind of like, okay, in the background of your experience, like your overall field of experience, is that in a consonant or dissonant state? Right? Like when it's in a dissonant state, it just feels like reality is off. There's like something wrong about reality itself. Whereas if the background is like harmonized, it actually feels like, oh, I'm in a highly meaningful, highly kind of divine or harmonized state of consciousness. Very similar to music. So this is why at QRI we consider valence really the underlying phenomenon, because it's not attached to like any particular sensory stream or sensory modality or frequency range. It's just the overall sense of harmony and dissonance of the state.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, so knowing that model then, how do we look at experiences where somebody might be seeming perverse? Do we suggest that they are experiencing positive valence when they hurt others? Or is it back to the bees model that their attention is so much on the sense that they're getting above somebody that gives them positive valence, and the negative valence that we would normally feel is just irrelevant?
Yeah, I would say so. Like that. I mean, one of the things in effect is like, one of the things that these bees do effectively is they create the sense of a self and other, like the fundamental partition of our experience of kind of the primordial duality. It does come from these, each bee in some sense is kind of like another way of partitioning your experience into like a self and another, or like a subject and an object. So effectively, if you have like a lot of your bees stuck up in your sense of self, you may fleetingly pay attention to other people's emotions, but you're always just comparing them and evaluating them in terms of like, okay, how are they going to affect my sense of self? And so, the way of representing other people's emotions is not going to be as like your own or like as part of you, or if you're in a very non-dual state, it's like, well, we're all one, so like your emotions are my emotions, and so one is kind of like going in the opposite direction. But like I would argue that like if the average person, let's say, has kind of a 70% dualistic perception of the world and 30% like non-dual, maybe a advanced Buddhist monk is like 90% non-dual, 10% dualistic. Somebody with narcissism might be something like 99% dualistic. It's like there's very little kind of like common ground, or very little sensations that belong to more than one, more than just them or somebody else. And if you actively represent something as an other, it's not even like you don't care about them. It's like just phenomenologically, they feel like an object. And like objects just don't matter fundamentally. Yeah. I mean, like there's of course like people who have object empathy, right? Like, but that's kind of actually when it's the other way around. I mean, like a 3-year-old kid like may actually feel very sad if you hit a rock, right? Like they say like, don't hurt the rock, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas like a narcissist would just never think that way, right? Like, in fact the opposite, they tend to perceive others as rocks, like they. Yeah. And in fact, like one of the problems with this is that it does kind of cause a persistent, all-encompassing kind of like sense of loneliness, because the capacity to connect with others is just so thin. Yeah. And also that causes a maximum in their valence. I mean, like basically all of the, like above a certain level of valence when it comes to like meditation states or rapturous states, pretty much all of them involve like some level of like softening of the ego. Partly because if you have like this very sharp partition between self and other, there's a whole region of your experience that you just don't care about, right? Like, whereas, if you're like in this more non-dual kind of like frame of mind, you're able to integrate more of your experience and really optimize the valence of the whole, as opposed to just like, this like tiny mini part of your experience and only caring about it, which is, again, like kind of deluded, right? Like you think that others are not you, or like even though they're actually part of your own experience.
So with this question then of the self and the other, I think now I have to ask more about your bees model. What happens if there are bees on this sense of self and other, and yet we get into, as you said, a non-dual state? Where's that bee going?
Yeah. Okay, so here's another important introduction. So each of these Bs is not only, or like, attention streams is not only, I mean, like in the basic framework, there will be sort of like, 7 spotlights or like 7 flashlights, where like they're like focusing on different parts of your experience, and sometimes they all come together to focus in one region. But they're actually a more general phenomenon. So like one of these Bs could actually kind of like function as a laser, like really just like focusing in one point in your experience. But also one of these Bs could function as a kind of like extremely diffuse light that is kind of like spreading out light everywhere all at once. And effectively, there is kind of like a wave particle duality to them, that some of your attention streams can be like very much like particle like or like very laser like, and some of them can be very wave like and very distributed. I think that the typical state of consciousness of most people, most of their Bs are actually in a very kind of like particle like state, where like they're very focused, they're very laser like. And it is kind of like that laser like quality that is partitioning the world, is making it like, oh, it's either this or that, or it's like you or me. Whereas if you shift them to this other more distributed state, more wave like state, the distinction between self and other becomes like much more wobbly and more porous, as it were. So my sense is that, like something like persistent non-dual awareness, is not incompatible with being able to have like empathy for others, or like even reasoning about others as, individuals, that they're not you in a certain sense. And yet maintaining this kind of like all-pervasive sense of oneness or, universal emptiness in the experience. And I think like the way that might happen is that rather than having like 7 Bs that each of them is kind of like a laser point, it might be more like, well, you actually now have like 2 or 3 Bs that are completely distributed. They're kind of like this like diffuse light, and they're not creating this partition between self and other. But you still need a few of them to kind of like be creating a little bit of the illusion of a self and other, to be able to just navigate the world, at all. That's, the more you practice, and talking to very, very advanced practitioners, effectively they say that, like the the path within this framework, it would be learning to use as few kind of like laser Bs as possible, like to keep most of your Bs in this distributed wave-like state, and only use like the bare minimum to fabricate the world and navigate around. And that kind of like maximizes how much of your awareness is in kind of this like non-dual state. You're not verifying a self and another. And you're maximizing valence for yourself. And also, for the most part, you're going to be taking into account other people's emotions as if they were your own. So they have kind of this like dual benefit of like, well, it makes you feel wonderful, and also it makes you more pro-social.
Wow. Well, Andrés Gómez-Emilsson, before we get to our last topic, for people who want to know more about your take on many of the things we've discussed, maybe these practices that you're talking about, I know you have contests as well, people who can illustrate ideas and things. Where should people be looking for you online?
Yeah, I mean, the most important website is QRI.org, Qualia Research Institute.org. That said, whatever we post in there tends to be, like having gone through several filters, is not very kind of like raw. It's just like more the polished material. If you want to see the most raw kind of like, hot takes, just follow me on Twitter, which is like, I'm Captain Pleasure in Twitter. Hashtag like Alche Calypso. But yeah, you'll find me with my name. And then, like the other 2 places, well, actually 3. Sorry, it's my YouTube channel. You can find on YouTube, just type my name. And the type of content that I make there is like hour-long presentations. Essentially, just me talking to the camera after preparing for 15 minutes. kind of raw, but a lot of people actually say like that's their favorite content from my whole kind of like production, which I find kind of like unexpected, to be honest. But people consume information in different ways, so it's very good to have like a diversity of options. And then finally, my blog, which traditionally has been qualiacomputing.com. And more recently, I'm like publishing in Substack. I tried in December and January to kind of like have like one post a day to kind of like build some momentum, some audience there. And in general, actually have been like quite impressed with the quality of the comments and the followers on Substack. So I'm probably going to be moving quite a bit of my communications that way. So highly recommend checking it out.
Okay. We'll put some links in the description for everyone to check out. And Andres, last of all, what do you think of the question of consciousness as it relates to artificial intelligence? And maybe we can explore that a little bit.
Yeah. So with my collaborator, Chris Percy, we started essentially another like offshoot of QRI we call the Co-Sentience Initiative, where we're exploring very much the question of AI consciousness, and in particular, what's called like computational functionalism, which is the idea that you can make sense of of the brain and of computational systems through, for example, the lens of like a Turing machine. That like, okay, like any given computational system you can prove with some arguments, you can translate it into a Turing machine. And so like maybe all you need to reason about minds is like reason about, hey, like what type of programs may be running in a Turing machine. Presumably some of those are conscious, some of those are not conscious. The website is called cf-debate.com, computational functionalism debate. And yeah, I mean, that research output is trying to be like as impartial as possible. I mean, essentially showing the Steelman argument, like the strongest version of the argument, both in favor and against the idea of digital computers potentially being conscious, or like AI systems like ChatGPT or Claude potentially being conscious. Now, where we stand as an organization, QRI, and most of our collaborators, it is actually a fairly heterodox view among kind of like people who are very educated and who care a lot about this topic, which is we're actually like quite confident that digital computers and current AI systems are not conscious, not in any way that like meaningfully matters for them being like moral patients. Now, this actually like tends to come up as a surprise to people because if QRI is trying to come up with a computational mathematical model of consciousness, surely if you generate the same computations in a in a digital system, it captures the essence of consciousness, right? Like what's actually missing in there. But yeah, as far as we can tell, there's a whole lot that is missing, and it's not cosmetic. It's not like we just need better algorithms. It's not that we just need a slightly more complex architectures or more layers of recursion or like embodiment. Like putting ChatGPT in a robot with sensors is also not going to make it conscious all of a sudden. The problem is like actually much more fundamental. The issue with digital computers is that the output that they produce is always understood and you can make sense of that entirely as the sum of the parts that makes it up. So a good analogy is Conway's Game of Life. For those who don't know, it's like this grid where like every square can be like black or white, and it has kind of this like universal state where each of the square grids is either black or white, and then there's like kind of this universal update where like you look at every one of the grid, any one of the cells, and based on its neighbors, you determine whether in the next step is going to be black or white, right? And you can like continue to update that way. And it is true that like a lot of like fascinating emergent structure can arise in a system like this. For example, a glider is like kind of like this little kind of like tiny bug in a sense that kind of like moves in a straight line, right? And intuitively, a lot of people kind of like look at that and say like, wow, that's like kind of a early indications of life, or like that's almost kind of like a tiny being or like a mini mind or something like that. But if you think about this very carefully, you will notice that, the glider is not really in the screen, right? Like in the screen, all there is a lot of cells that are either black or white. The person who's actually drawing a line around the glider and saying, hey, this is a integrated being or organism is you, right? Like you are the observer who has an integrated visual field. You can parse information and you can see it as a unified object. And in a sense, perceiving it as a glider is very helpful for you because it allows you to make long predictions about the system, right? Like if all you see is like a gigantic white screen and one tiny glider, you can instantly know, in 100 steps, you're going to have that glider, but like all the way over here. And it's going to be, everything else will stay the same. Now, that is not something that the screen itself knows, right? Like the crazy thing is like in Conway's Game of Life, by its very construction, all that, anything knows anything at all is like every cell knows about its own local environment. And that's it, right? Like there's no mechanism that is like integrated information across like, a wide region of the screen and saying like, okay, now this is an object. This behaves like an object. All of that is like just in your mind. So by its very construction, a cellular automaton is such that whatever object arises is always exactly equal to the sum of its parts. Whereas a moment of experience, an actual, like qualia bundle, like a subjective now, contains many pieces of information all at once. Even just your visual field has a lot of like values of color and texture and depth and so on. And that needs to happen at once for you to even have like any meaning associated to it. Where like if you were to only experience like features like one at a time, right? Like they would never actually come together into a unified screen or a unified experience. There's like some conceptual, clarifications here to be made about again, like the role of attention and awareness, in that like attention can be like fairly sequential. Except, again, in one of these like non-dual states where like attention is more kind of diffuse and all at once. And again, like justifying the importance of like non-room temperature consciousness to kind of like give you a sense of like, hey, like all the ways in which consciousness can operate. But yes, no, effectively, each moment of experience has many pieces of information at once. And clearly that must be useful. Like evolution must have found a reason, to actually put together this information all at once, meaning that it must have some behavior that is like strictly more than just the sum of the parts. And actually, this is like common in physics, right? Like a lot of people intuitively think of physics as a cellular automaton, as if we were kind of like a scaled up version of Conway's Game of Life. But that's just not the case. Like if you want to actually know what happens in a particular microscopic system, you cannot get away with just kind of like partitioning it and then like modeling each of the parts independently and just like looking at local environments interacting with each other. When it comes to things like quantum coherence and entanglement, you actually need to take into account the entire system as a whole, and then do something kind of like a energy minimization algorithm on that system as a whole, or solve Schrodinger's equation on that entire system as a whole. So clearly in physics, we have like situations where the whole is literally more than the sum of the parts, or like that you cannot make sense of the whole just as the parts interacting. And based on, the unity of experience, the multiple amounts of information expressed all at once in each experience, we can reason that this is also the case with consciousness. So there has to be some mechanism of action in the brain, in the nervous system, that is putting together a whole lot of information and matter and energy and making it act as a unit in a unified, holistic fashion. Exactly what that is, we don't know. We're proposing a lot of hypotheses. We're very keen on, like testing these hypotheses. We don't actually think it has to be like as exotic as something like quantum coherence. There's like other much more classical kind of like versions of these. Like for example, electromagnetic field topology is a possible candidate. Delocalized electrons is another candidate. But just from philosophy of mind alone, and like reasoning through, like, okay, why are we conscious and why is our consciousness so rich? I do think we can make the very, very strong case that just putting together, parts of a cellular automaton will just not generate a unified experience. You actually need like something else, some other mechanism of action. And the problem is that, like digital computers are essentially kind of scaled up cellular automatons. Like it is always the case that what is happening is exactly just the sum of its parts. And in fact, like the very way a computer is built is with that in mind. Is like, how do we separate, let's say, like the transistors, right? So that transistor is not influencing its neighbors, right? It's like, how do we make it as local as possible? Whereas that doesn't seem to be the case in the brain and in biological organisms, right? Like you're adding these long-range connections, and it's not only chemical and mechanical, it's also electromagnetic waves, and they're all bouncing against each other. It's like a very, very integrated, holistic kind of architecture. So yeah, I think like we're hitting the wrong nail, as it were, if we think like, yeah, consciousness will come from one of these systems.
Wow. I would wonder what you think about robotics and the sense of being embodied in the world, and how that would play into this idea of consciousness or not with a computer.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually like a common argument, for example, with Searle's Chinese room. Very classic, thought experiment in philosophy of mind, where there's like a little person inside a room that is getting like Chinese symbols and is processing it with a rule book, and delivering outputs, kind of like being a computer for a large language model or something like that. And I mean, some people actually claim, okay, like the Chinese room is not conscious and doesn't understand Chinese, but if you were to embed it in a robot that interacts with the world, it would kind of like wake up, given like the dynamic cybernetic interactions with its environment. But as we talked about earlier in the conversation, dreaming shows that you don't need an active interaction with the world to actually be conscious, right? Like you can actually separate kind of a dynamic embodiment from like consciousness itself as a phenomenon. So it doesn't seem like that kind of embodiment really gives you any additional ingredient that would kind of like make the system wake up. And also, I would argue that, if you build a system in the proper way to be conscious, it would not need to be embodied. It could just be dreaming, and maybe even without anybody like knowing that, there's a complex world simulation there. It's just not connected to to outward senses or motor outputs. That said, embodiment I do think is very important, and it's very important for Valence, but not in the radical sense that like your consciousness, your awareness is literally distributed in your body. Is something a little bit more subtle. Is that the internal world simulation rendered in your brain is causally and via resonance interconnected with states in the body, and actually presumably through kind of like a frequency shift. I mean, something like our representation of like our heartbeat and what's going on in our stomach, our respiration and so on. My sense is that it's actually being like frequency shifted and transformed to like a much higher register, so that we can process it in our consciousness. And so our true body, as it were, is actually moving and behaving and resonating at much lower frequencies. We have kind of like a high frequency image of it. And so your experience of the body is not actually your body, right? It's like it's not exactly a reflection, but it's more kind of like a mannequin that is connected via wiring to a gigantic structure that it is out there in the world. But like you can actually sever those connections. You might still feel like you have a body, right? Like again, like with sleep paralysis, I've had like all of these crazy experiences of like feeling like I'm like moving and walking around, and then like I realize, oh shit, I'm actually just completely still. And so like you don't actually need like your body to move in order to have like really complex phenomenology of embodiment.
Wow. Well, Andrés Gómez-Emilsson, it seems like we are just getting started. And as I've heard other interviewers say, you have so much to share that in answering questions, you open new ones. And I am so grateful to you for sharing that with me and for the work that you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brad. Really, really appreciate it, and I had a lot of fun.